I thought it'd be interesting to share with you a few creation stories from around the world. As you could imagine, we could probably spend a class on each of these particular stories. And as an archaeologist uh, studying ancient civilizations and societies, I do spend a lot of time examining these ancient texts as part of my research with regard to the evolution of culture, the evolution of religious thoughts and beliefs and practices over time, especially within the ancient societies of the Mediterranean world. However, we're going to now return back to the theory of evolution, beginning with the story of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution as we know it today. His book, The Origin of Species, is the basis for modern evolution and speciation theories. Darwin basically proposed that new species originated from ancestral species that changed over time. He further stated that the process for this evolutionary change over time was due to the mechanism of natural selection. However, Charles Darwin wasn't the only person who conceptualized the theory of evolution. A contemporary of his, Alfred Wallace, independently also developed the theory of evolution. However, both Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin did co author the original paper proposing natural selection as the mechanism behind evolution. Darwin's theory is based on four postulates. Darwin regarded life in nature as a competition where the fittest individual wins. The fitness of an individual refers to how well it survives and reproduces compared to other individuals in the population. Traits that increase the fitness of an organism relative to individuals without those traits makes it better adapted. However, Darwin could not explain how variation was passed from one generation to the next or how these traits were generated. That was later solved by individuals such as Gregor Mendel. Based on experiments with pea plants, Mendel formed laws about segregation and assortment of traits. And later on, Thomas Hunt Morgan's group at Columbia University demonstrated that Mendel's hypothetical factors are specific points on the chromosomes found within various organisms. Let us review and briefly define evolution again. Evolution is one of the most fundamental organizing principles of the biological sciences, and as such is the single most dominant theme in biology today. Evolution is essentially the process by which nature selects from the genetic diversity of a population those traits that would make an individual more likely to survive and reproduce in a continuously changing environment. Over many years and many generations, the full diversity of life on Earth is expressed. Evolution stresses the relatedness of all life rather than its differences. It provides a framework, a unifying principle, if you will, for the way that we study and understand the living world. It's a way of bringing together many diverse aspects of life's tremendous complexities. Organisms adapt to their environment as it changes. Over time, these populations may change in their appearance and other visible characteristics, which ultimately results in changes in their genetic structure. And over long periods of time, these changes could be significantly different from what the original organism started with. These changes could take tens of thousands and millions of years. While no one has been able to observe these changes in person that have caused speciation, we do, however, have an increasing amount of fossil data that shows the evolution of one species from another showing the changes over time within the geological record. And today, with molecular techniques such as genome mapping, we can actually observe and measure the rate of evolution in many species. The theory of evolution by natural selection essentially states all living things consist of a unique combination of chemicals organized in unique ways, and variation occurs in all species. No two individuals are alike. Species populations are able to adapt to gradual changes in the environment. The same species in different parts of the world have different tolerances and slightly different characteristics to survive the local conditions in which it lives. However, despite these differences, they're still the same species. They can interbreed naturally where they come into contact. Most of these variations have a genetic basis. Therefore, these variations can be passed onto the organism's offspring. Each species produces more offsprings than will survive into maturity. Those individuals whose variations best fit their environment will be more likely to survive and reproduce. Therefore, fitness equals the ability to reproduce. Organisms in a species with less favorable variation will be less likely to survive. Therefore, their traits are less likely to pass on to the next generation. You were asked to read the article, What Darwin's Finches Can Teach Us About the Evolutionary Origin and Regulation of Biodiversity. In this article, key factors were identified for the biodiversity found within a given environment. These factors are environmental change, natural selection, and cultural evolution. When Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, descent with modification was not a particularly new or controversial idea. Darwin's intellectual leap was to propose the mechanism by which evolution occurred. The mechanism, called natural selection, is a description of what happens when variation occurs in a population where the resources are limited, such as in the example of the Darwin's finches. When more individuals are born than the environment can support, those with advantageous variations are more likely to survive than those without them. The differential reproduction, this differential reproduction leads to overall changes in traits of a population over time. Other mechanisms of evolution besides natural selection include sexual selection and genetic drift. Sexual selection occurs when individuals of one sex are attracted to mates with which manifest certain traits. For example, the peacock's tail or a mating call of the finches. Genetic drift is the random fluctuations that naturally occur in a population's gene pool when the population is small. The best adapted individuals do not always survive to reproduce, however, while poorly adapted individuals don't always die before passing on their genes. But over time, in small populations, genetic drift can lead to noticeable changes. More recently, it has been proposed that a group of organisms could sometimes benefit from its members behaving in ways that would otherwise be detrimental to an individual organism. This so called group selection takes into account the survival needs of an entire community of a given species. Genetic mutation is also a source of variation and a mechanism of evolution. Darwin recognized from his years of study that when any organism reproduces, new variants sometimes arises. Although he didn't know it at the time, these differences were a consequence of mutations. Mutations, as you learned in the genetics lecture, are changes in DNA that occur due to errors in the DNA replication, and this is sometimes brought about through exposure to radiation or certain chemicals in the environment. The vast majority of mutations are neutral or harmful and are not preserved. But occasionally, beneficial mutations do occur that are preferential and passed down through the generations. As the Finch's article points out, the environment and cultural evolution that took place on the Galapagos Islands also plays a significant role in the species evolutionary process. Broadly speaking, evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. Biologists sometimes define two types of evolution based on scale. There's macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution refers to large scale changes that occur over extended time periods, such as the formation of new species and groups. Microevolution refers to small scale changes that affect just one or a few genes and happen in populations over shorter timescales. Microevolution and macroevolution aren't really different processes, they are the same process occurring on different timescales. Microevolutionary processes occurring over thousands or millions of years can add up to large scale changes that define new species or groups. The evidence for evolutionary change can be found by comparing homologous structures. Homologous structures are similar structures having similar anatomical positions and functions in different organisms, suggesting they share a common ancestor having those similarities. To make things a little more interesting and complicated, not all physical features that look alike are marks of common ancestry. Instead, some physical similarities are analogous. They have evolved independently in different organisms because the organisms lived in similar environments or experienced similar selective pressures. This process is called convergent evolution. Additional evidence for evolution can be found in molecular biology, specifically with regard to the DNA and genetic code. DNA and genetic code reflect the shared ancestry of life. DNA comparisons can show how related species are. And as you learned in the genetics module from last week, mutation can affect the evolution of a species over time. Other evidence for evolution can be suggested from biogeography. Biogeography is the global distribution of organisms and the unique features of particularly island species reflecting evolution and geological changes. In addition to biogeography, there is the fossil record. Fossils document the existence of non existent past species that are related to present day species. Fossils are the preserved remains or the traces of animals, plants, and other organisms from the past. Fossils provide evidence that organisms from the past are not the same as those found today. Fossils show a progression of evolution. Fossils, along with the comparative anatomy of present day organisms, constitute the morphological or anatomical record. Paleontologists can determine the age of fossils using methods like radiometric dating and categorize them to determine the evolutionary relationship between organisms.